Hi, thank you for joining us for ARDE 2020 virtual. And I'm delighted today to be joined by three of my favorite water experts in the West. And today we're discussing democracy, climate, and water in the West. First up, I'd like to introduce Tillie Walton, who is a longtime river guide and expert on the Colorado River. She's been down many trips throughout the Grand Canyon and on the Colorado River, and has recently completed a trip just a few weeks ago. Welcome, Tillie. And next, I'd like to introduce Rave Mehta, who is also a river aficionado and recently went down the Colorado River, but also is creating something called Water Ledger. And he'll tell us more about that, but that's about how we can help to fund and fix some of the issues that we're experiencing in the water conversation in the West and throughout the world, and particularly regarding climate. Welcome, Rave. And then finally, David Marquis is an author. He is a producer, a man of many hats, and who comes from Dallas, Texas, who recently wrote a wonderful book called The River Always Wins. And he'll be adding his unique perspective to today's conversation. So welcome, David.
Glad to be here, Chip. Thank you.
So today, I would like to discuss with you all some of the pressing issues that we're facing. And to create a context for that, the hydrological cycles of the planet Earth are being exacerbated and stretched out through the continued burning of fossil fuels and putting carbon up into the atmosphere, coupled with the demands of an increasing population, particularly in the West. And the Colorado River supplies over 40 million people from Los Angeles to Phoenix to Las Vegas with their drinking water. But we also have to realize that the agricultural use of this water and the use for the extraction of fossil fuels is really putting pressure on the ability of the system to feed the people, to provide adequate drinking water and use for the human population. So I think that if we can connect today's conversation with climate and water, but through the lens of conservation and then also remediation, but also with a opportunity to talk about it in terms of what is water? What are the spiritual ramifications and aspects? And I think that I'd like to start with Tillie. Maybe you could paint us a picture of your recent trip down the Colorado.
Sure. We just spent 8 magical days floating on the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon during the midst of COVID. So it was really special. And approximately 6 million people come to visit the Grand Canyon each year, and we were one of 20,000 that got to float down the river. And rivers, especially the Colorado River, are super unique and super special because the Colorado River is it's in a desert environment, and the Colorado River flows through these 7 basin states. And even though it makes up kind of less than 1% of the land area in the desert Southwest, it provides habitat and life for over 90% of the species. So rivers are super important and very vital. And just to give a little demonstration of how unique a river is, we live on a planet that's covered with 70% water. And so you might think, well, we have so much water, what's the big deal? Well, most of that water on Earth is 97% of it is made up of salt water, which is in the oceans, which we can't drink. And so less than 3% of all water on Earth is fresh water. And then of that 3%, most of it's stored in groundwater or frozen in glaciers, and less than 1% of that 3% it exists in rivers. So having the opportunity to experience a river, and this is what all life depends upon, is really, really unique. So I'll show you some clips of us rafting in the Grand Canyon and just the beauty of it all. But to have this experience of being on a river, it's something that I wish that everybody had the opportunity to do.
Wonderful. And Ravi, I know that you were with Tilly on that recent trip. Maybe you can give us your perspective from that experience. And I think it was your first time going down there.
Yes, Chip. It was an amazing trip. Like Tilly said, it was in the midst of COVID, so it's good to get away from all the news and media and be completely off the grid for 8 days. I think we did 200 miles of river, over 100 rapids, some really beautiful hikes, and slept under the stars, every night, which I've never done. And you could clearly see the Milky Way and all the stars and galaxies just hovering above your head, like it was like within arm's length away. So it's super beautiful. And the water was very cold because the water comes out from the bottom of the dam. So it's around 55 degrees, plus or minus 5 degrees. Actually, plus or minus 2 degrees. It didn't get that much warmer. And so taking cold, baths and stuff in the river, over the 8 days, definitely wakes you up and gives you another perspective on your hot showers that we do. So yeah, it was beautiful. Definitely a transformational experience, and we decided to do more of these river trips. And it ties directly into a lot of the work that we're doing right now, which is at Water Ledger, we're focused on creating a offset credit market to help replenish these river basins. As you know, the Colorado River is less than 40% of its capacity and continues to drop, largely driven by climate change and population growth, but also by rules and laws such as use it or lose it rights, where farmers are required to use their water to keep it, so they tend to over irrigate so they can maintain their water right. And therefore, we not only have a water scarcity issue, we also have a water management issue that compounds that significantly. So our work is focusing on building a water offset credit market, similar to the carbon markets, but for water, to help incentivize and reward those that can put water back into the river and create credits that can be purchased by companies and organizations that are looking to offset their water footprint. And there's a growing trend, a significantly growing trend of companies looking to do that. Microsoft and Intel just announced this year they're going to go water positive by 2030, which means they're going to offset more than their water footprint by 2030.
That's fantastic. I'm so glad that you're approaching the corporate perspective on water. I think that Americans must learn the issues surrounding water. They think that water just comes out of a tap and they don't really think much beyond that. So really looking forward to digging into that a little bit deeper later on. And finally, David, you have written a book recently, The River Runs Through It. And, tell us what that really means.
Thank you, Chip. And first, I'd like to say what an honor it is to be on today with the three of you. It's a pleasure and honor, and I'm glad to have the opportunity. As my book is called The River Always Wins, and it comes from a deep sense of longing that I have to be near water. Many years ago, I was standing on a bridge outside Taos, New Mexico, looking down into the gorge of the Rio Grande, and had this profound sense of what it took for that river to wind its way and work its way all the way down to the bottom of that gorge through all that rock, and had a clear sense that one way or another, over long periods of time, the river always wins. And the through line of the book is that if enough drops flow together in the same direction long enough, the river always wins. Now, I believe that as a purpose for human beings also, to understand that if enough good people to come together and work enough for a long period of time, that we will overcome many of the challenges we face. And to do that, we have to have many ways to address that. One is the way that Ravi is doing it, finding ways that we can practically solve problems and get people to conserve, to replenish, to use market sources. Another way is the way Tilly does it, to get people close to the water, which is always a great thing. And then there's a way that I do it by writing about it. And I'll take a moment to read to you briefly from the beginning of chapter 5 the course of the river. Rivers do not run in straight lines, neither do our lives. The river is an artist, raising its hammer and chisel, sculpting its way to the art of its bed, finding the shape of the rock that is its own course. For no two rivers in the world run the same, neither do our lives. So I approach rivers from the spiritual point of view. And also in the book, there's science, there's history, but I try to bring all that together in such a way that we understand that if we come together, we will, like a river, go all the way to the sea, or what I call the greater water.
Well, thank you, David. And I mistakenly confused you with Robert Redford for a moment back there, I think.
Well,
Here is a wonderful book. I want to hold it up for everybody to see because it's an extraordinary work that is so inspirational, and I recommend it to anybody watching this program.
thank you.
I'd like to dive deep into what you mentioned, the spiritual aspects of the water that runs through the planet. And as we know, all the great rivers of the world empty into the sea ultimately. And the sea is the great circulator of life, and it's where life began. So maybe Tilly, could you tell us a little bit about some of your experiences going down the Colorado River in that regard, and what does it feel like to really, immerse into those amazing drainages and canyons?
Yeah, it's hard to actually put into words what it feels like, but I think maybe it's because we ourselves are almost 70% water. I think all of us have an innate connection physically and spiritually to water. And so for me, what I experience when I'm on the river are a couple of things. One is, to me, a river trip is about being in the moment. It's a series of moments. And because the river requires you to be present with each thing that's happening, there's no time to be elsewhere. So it becomes almost like time slows down, and it's almost like a moving meditation to be on the water and rowing and to be almost one with water. And then what I've noticed with groups and people when we get together on the water and the river is that we kind of have these outer shells that we identify ourselves with. It's our job title, what kind of car we drive, these ego type of things that really kind of are clothing around our true self or our soul or our spirit. And my experience has been when we're out in nature, especially for these extended periods of time, and we're next to this flowing, moving water that's life, it allows us to shed these outside layers and they kind of fall off. And as almost like an onion peels away, we get down and eventually we're relating to ourselves and we're realizing, this is a soul to soul or human to human, however you want to look at it. And you really see the person's true self. And it's a huge opportunity for us to all realize that we're one and the same. And that these things, I always say the river is the great equalizer. And so that water in many senses is the great equalizer. And it makes us realize that the thread that runs between us all is that we're all connected and we're all the same. And so I guess that's my experience to me, being on the river is a very nourishing, and it just feels like home to me when I'm on the water. It feels like I'm home.
So water would be the great connector of all things. And David, can you talk a little bit about, if the river always wins, and what you're talking about is the flow. And I know Ravi has a lot to say about the flow and the flow state. Maybe we can go in there.
Well, I'd like to mention that if you look at spiritual traditions from around the planet, water's in the midst of all that. The first words of Genesis, chapter 1:1, is about water. The Ganges, for the Hindu tradition, is the river Ganges. That's the holy spot place. In South Sea Island culture, the creation myths, the creation stories all have to do with the goddess coming from the sea, providing abundance and blessings. It's just constant throughout our human traditions to have water as a part of that. And I would like to point out that I come from a place of loving water because I grew up in a place where there was very little water. I grew up in West Texas during the drought of the 50s. My aunt, uncle, all passed now, but grandmother, my mother, all grew up in a dust bowl. The horrors of bad economic policy and bad environmental policy that led to the horrible dust storms in the 30s. Well, I grew up in the 50s in West Texas, the second dustiest period next to the Dust Bowl. And we used to walk home from school backwards to keep the howling sand out of our faces and out of our lungs. So I grew up in a place where water was very scarce. And as a result, especially now with grandchildren, I want to leave the world better for them. So water is a major factor in my life. And one of the most profound experiences of my life with water was going to Missouri, to a town called Cape Girardeau. And just outside there, the Missouri and the Mississippi converge. Those two rivers come together at that point, and you can stand right there on the banks and see those two rivers come together. It's a profound experience. So I think that if we look at interwoven our spiritual traditions are, our customs are, how much it affects our economics, our ability to get to water, to transport it easily, to have access to it, is a huge determinant of whether or not people will be able to succeed or live comfortably. And then the opportunities that we have to be close to it, and you tie all that together, and you begin to get a sense of the cultural and spiritual traditions all coming from water. And it's never more precious than for those who live in deserts. We talk about, shall we gather at the River Jordan in the middle of a desert. So it's very much a part of who we are as human beings, no matter where we are in the world.
Yeah, thank you for that. Rave is an extraordinary musician on top of many other talents, and he created something that you call the flow, I think. Could you tell us a little bit about that and how that might connect through what Tilly and David are describing?
Sure, yeah. The theme of my whole life seems to be around this concept of flow, and which touches many different aspects of my life and everything else. But flow states, for example, when we're in the flow state, for example, we're in a zone where we feel connected to everything else, and we somehow access or align our energies and life force to be able to do amazing things. Athletes, when they tap into flow, they break world records, defy death, do superhuman things that they normally would not be able to do if they were not in that state. So there's a lot of science moving behind this to understand and learn how we could actually consciously tap into our own flow state. The planet itself has its own state, its own flow, its own harmony as well. And when the rivers are flowing and reaching the oceans, and the oceans are circulating that water back into land, and through precipitation and so on and so forth, the planet has its own flow, its own harmonic convention, so to speak. So what's interesting in how this all ties to climate is the biggest impact of climate change is water, floods and droughts, and that's what we experience. You do experience some temperature changes and whatnot, but the biggest impact of that temperature change is water and floods and droughts. And then how the oceans are the biggest carbon storage unit we have, but how the rivers actually act as a circulatory network to bring the inland carbon through the rivers to the ocean to store. So us as biological beings, we're made of, as Tilly said, 70-80% water, and so is the planet. But we function very similarly as well. The rivers are the arteries and the veins that move carbon to the ocean, for it to be stored and then oxygen to be released through the other mechanisms. So to be in flow is to be connected, and to be connected is when everything is working in harmony with each other, both individually, like us individually, as collectively as a species, and then us in harmony with our planet.
We're experiencing some very radical shifts in our global climate patterns, our weather patterns, our hydrological cycle. we put so much carbon in the atmosphere that it's displaced much of the water. And so can we talk about the flow state as it relates to the spiritual reality and the physical impacts, and how that can be effectively addressed in terms of solutions?
Sure. Are you asking me again? Sorry. So as far as solutions, once again, it's all about bringing everything back into harmony. And, you know, the one thing, I just want to digress a little bit, because the one thing I forgot to mention is when I was on that river trip, sleeping under the stars, staring at all these galaxies and planets and solar systems that are, you know, the one thing that kept occurring to me is what we did not realize decades ago. You know, we thought that Earth, our planet, was rare because it had water. And then over time, we started realizing that water is in, you know, a lot of these other astral bodies, you know, like Europa and whatnot. And then most recently, we discovered water on the moon, on the sunlit side of the moon, which now makes it possible for us to go and set up a lunar base of some kind there, because now we have water to work with. And right before the trip, there was an announcement that we may have just found the first alien microbe in the atmosphere of Venus. And about 1 million years ago, Venus had water, and we already know that Mars had water as well. So water seems to be much beyond our planet, the thread that connects, you know, life around the universe. And I would even go further and say it might be the thread that connects all consciousness. So, you know, if you think in terms of water as the connector of consciousness across the universe, and then if you zoom in to our our planet, and then even our bodies and our cells and so on and so forth, it is the one prevalent theme that we take for granted for the most part, but permeates every aspect of our lives. So go back to solutions on how to bring that back into harmony and balance. I think creating mechanisms. I come at this from a market-based approach, because we find that capital and creating an economy or some kind of economic mechanism incentivize and directs behaviors much faster than anything else. So some of the mechanisms we're creating is that incentive structure to reward and incentivize people to move water or rebalance water back into the environment against their own use, or the use of agriculture or the use of industry. So that's been my focus. I know Tilly, for example, has a different approach with her work in building projects that reclaim water or reclaim land around rivers. And maybe she might want to touch on that.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, if you look at rivers, if you look at the earth as a living, breathing entity, and if you are to think of rivers as the veins and arteries that are carrying the lifeblood of this planet along, it's just like, we need these things to be free flowing in order for life to thrive. And so when we have taken our rivers and put dams where we stop the flow of water, and where we're withdrawing so much water, or say if it was a patient, we're withdrawing so much blood from their system, or we're putting a tourniquet on their arm, it's hard for the body to thrive. And so what we've essentially done with a lot of our rivers, very few are free flowing anymore. And so reconnecting to water as a source and reconnecting our rivers, to recognize that as a living, breathing entity, and as our rivers as being almost a breathing, living entity, that we need to take care of them. And there's many ways to do that on, I'll just talk a little bit because I have a hydrology background. On a physical level, operating a river so that, as we're talking that climate change, one of the most obvious things is this change in the amount of water we have, whether it's torrential downpours or droughts. But the rivers have designed a system where they tend to flood in the spring and get lower in the fall. And as we've put dams on these rivers and we've blocked that normal functioning cycle, all life which is developed to depend on this cycle has been disrupted. And so we've created systems where they've been taken over by invasive species, where, you know, instead of a river meandering and slowing down the flood waters, we've created straightened channels and systems. And so usually the wetlands along a river would act as a sponge. And as the floods come, the waters are absorbed quickly and easily. And in that sponge-like activity, it also filters out pollutants and helps purify the water. So on a physical level, we can help reclaim that by doing a lot of river restoration projects. We've worked on some of the largest restoration projects on the Colorado River, where we've taken out a lot of the non-native plants and planted native plants. But even almost just as importantly, what we've done is we've reconnected communities to the river. And so one of the things that I've noticed in our work is that it's not just reviving the biological plant-based animals, wildlife, it's our connection as humans to the water and taking desolate places that aren't safe to go and making them friendly, where families can bring their children down to the river and safely play along the river or swim in it. So those are some of the ways we can do things. There's many other sustainable things we can get into, but those are a few pieces.
Great. Well, I'd like to
Chip?
I'm going to ask you to conclude, David, because
Okay.
we're coming to the end of our first session here, and I'm going to invite everybody to join us in the next half an hour. We'll continue this conversation and get more deeply into some of those solutions. But David, why don't you, tell us how you see what Tilly was talking about, what Robbie's talking about, and then perhaps conclude this with one of your brilliant passages, if you would.
Sure, thank you. One of the projects I'm working on right now is to restore the original bed of the Trinity River before it was channelized and had levees built around it. So we're building an urban wetlands near downtown Dallas to filter storm water every year, to do it through native plants. So we are building an urban wetlands near downtown that will be a beautiful public space, a gathering space, an economic development driver for the community, and as well a place that restores the bed of the original river. So I believe in projects like that, because if you look at the fact that we have overwhelmed Mother Nature's abilities to filter water and to replenish our water systems just with vast numbers of people congregated in central areas. As a result, we have to take responsibility to try to restore those natural areas and to do it through native plants and through real sensitivity to the environment and to the community. So we have to remind ourselves always that as soon as we enter a natural system, we have to take responsibility for it. And that's something that we have to do. We also have to be aware of what the river's for. And Tilly brought this up the other day, the sense of the river having its own rights. So let's talk about this. Let's read this. The river goes where it can, and then once it has amassed enough power, where it will. Along its way, the river provides, it gives of itself, its services, quenching and nurturing and transporting, but it is not here for us. It has its own somewhere to go, to run its own course, and we can go with it or not. But whether we choose to travel with it or not, it will travel its course. It lends drinking water and sustains crops, offers its banks for economic development, carries barges and stimulates commerce, opens its arms to recreation and fishing. Yet none of those are the reason the river runs. Its singular purpose is to traverse its course until it reaches the greater water, to leave the watershed where it began and move on. That is the course of the river, to constantly leave itself, to move on by leaving behind. Watersheds, diverse and adaptive, write themselves into the earth, for water must have a means to leave the land.
Wonderful. Thank you, David. Well, folks, please come and join us for part 2 of our water series with Tilly and Rave and David. And thank you all so much for your thoughts and wisdom on this the first part of our program.